Hi there, you're welcome to HisGov TV. My name is Collins Nanaya Abebrese, and in this lesson, we are going to look at the bond of 1844, or the signing of the bond of 1844 by the British and the local people. And so, without wasting much time, let's take a look at our lesson objectives for today. So one of our lesson objectives is that by the end of this lesson, you should be able to outline the reasons for the signing of the bond of 1844, and then also identify the terms of the bond of 1844, and then also discuss the significance or the importance of the bond of 1844. And then the last one will be identify or name any of the states whose rulers signed the bond of 1844. And so these four objectives are what we will be dealing with in the course of our discussion. Now, before we go into the terms in the bond, now the bond of 1844 has been one of the controversial topics or bond in the colonial history of Ghana. Now, many scholars assume that the bond of 1844 marked the beginning of colonial rule in the Gold Coast. Others also have different views with regards to the fact that the signing of the bond marked the beginning of colonial rule. So I think for me, I'm neutral. After the lesson, we would look at the terms in the bond and see if really the bond of 1844 marked or began colonial rule in the Gold Coast. So what was the bond of 1844? Now, the bond of 1844 was signed by one British governor called Commander Hill, and Commander Hill signed the bond with assistance by Maclean, who at this time had been appointed as a judicial assessor. And this bond was signed among 8 coastal states. So it is very important to note that the bond of 1844 was not signed, or those in the forest areas were not part of the bond of 1844. And that is to talk about the Asantes. The bond of 1844 was signed mainly by chiefs in the coastal areas, and there were 8 in number. The bond was signed on the 6th of March 1844. Okay, 6th of March 1844. And that even explains the reason why the independence of Ghana was actually slated on the 6th March of 1957. Some people claim that is to reverse the bond, which they believe gave the British the authority, or the people accepted that the British should rule them. And so we attaining independence, or fixing our independence date on the 6th of March, reverse the 1844. And as I have earlier indicated, you would judge for yourself whether really the bond of 1844, or the terms in the bond of 1844, was the beginning of colonial rule, or it can be termed as the beginning of colonial rule in the country. So let's go and look at the events, because before we can understand the bond, we need to look at the events leading to the signing of the bond. So let's go in there and look at the events and the terms of the bond, and even the chiefs who also signed the bond. And then we will then talk about the importance and as well as the reasons for the signing of the bond of 1844.
In the first place, between 1828 and 1843, the administration of the British forts and castles along the coast was given to the British Company of Merchants. George Maclean was appointed president of the council. The British government instructed the company to exercise their authority and jurisdiction only over the people living within the British forts and castles, not in any way to interfere in local politics. George Maclean's administration, however, ignored the order. He extended the power and jurisdiction of the British beyond the castle by signing the Peace Treaty of 1831 with Asante and the Fante people. In addition, he set up a police system, a magistrate court, and abolished slave trade and human sacrifices. George Maclean was accused of interfering in local politics of the people. However, in 1842, the report of the Select Committee of the British Parliament on Maclean's administration exonerated him of charges levied against him, but recommended that the British government assume direct administration of its forts and castles in the Gold Coast. Hence, Commander Hill was appointed governor of the Gold Coast, and Maclean made judicial assessor in the British administration. On his assumption of office, Commander Hill, assisted by George Maclean, persuaded 8 coastal states to adopt a declaration, popularly known as the Bond of 1844, to regularize Maclean's administration. The bond was signed on 6 March 1844 at Adanse Fomena in this building. Now let's take a look at the terms or clauses of the bond of 1844 signed by Commander Hill. 1. The chiefs accepted the right of the British to maintain justice according to British law. The British were also to protect the chiefs, their people, and property. 2. Human sacrifices and other barbarous customs such as canyaring were unlawful. 3. The third clause stated that criminal cases like murder and robbery were to be tried in courts made up by British judges and native rulers. Customary laws were to be used inasmuch as they kept within the principles of British. So let's take a look at chiefs who were signatories to the bond of 1844. Kojo Tibo of Danjura, Kwesi Otin of Ambra, Tibo Kuma and Jamra, both of Asin, Kwesi Anka of Domase, Ewusi of Domnasi, Amonu of Anumabo, Joseph Agri of Cape Coast. In that same year, 10 other rulers signed the document. They were the chiefs of these following states: Chufo, Ekumfi, Ejumako, Kumwa, Esikuma, Nsaba, Wasa Amenfi, Wasa Fiase, Disco, Jamestown in Accra. The importance of the bond has been exaggerated in some history books. Some actually date the beginning of British colonial rule in the Gold Coast with the day the bond was signed. It is clear that the chiefs did not give their lands to the British government, nor did they bind themselves and their people to become British subjects. The bond developed close relationships between the British and the coastal states. It must be clear that with the signing of the bond, the southern states looked up to the British to provide them with social amenities such as schools, roads, and hospitals. The signing of the bond also marked the beginning of the use of English laws or British legal systems in the coastal states. The bond also made it possible to keep in check other cruel practices like human sacrifices.
Why did the British decide to sign the bond of 1844? 1. Maclean had exercised British influence in Ghana without any official approval, and so the bond was signed therefore as a pledge to recognize Maclean's political achievement. And we all know the activities of Maclean. If you do not know the activities of Maclean, I have a video on Maclean. You can search in there and you'll get it. And so because Maclean had exercised the British influence illegally by signing the tripartite treaty with the people, the British then had to make it formal, all right, yes, to make it official, and so they had to sign another bond. And basically because Maclean had succeeded in trying to calm the people down, of course, with the British governor could not do. Again, too, the British Parliament, for the British Parliament Select Committee of 1830, also asked the British in Ghana to regularize their relations with the people. Now, after the 1826 Dodowa War, you realize that the British were fed up with the Gold Coast and the behaviors of the Asante. And so they had to actually leave the Gold Coast, and they left the castle in the hands of the merchants, and Maclean was appointed. And so looking at the activities of Maclean, being able to calm both Asante and the southern states, down, being able to bring peace back in the colony or in the Gold Coast at that time. Of course, the British Parliament Select Committee then recommended in the British Parliament that they should assume authority again over the Gold Coast, because now things are okay. Now, 3, the Asante threat was also a factor. After Maclean's tripartite treaty of 1831, the British still feared that the Asantes will still attack the coastal states. And so in order to protect the individual life and property along the coast, the bond was also signed. And then 4, human sacrifices and other customs like pioneering were also common among the people. And so the bond was signed to stress on the need, to abolish these inhuman practices. And so if you recall, in the terms of the bond, of course, one of them is of course, human sacrifice and pioneering were all abolished. Now, the bond was also signed to maintain justice and peace along the coast. And so murders and robberies and other crimes and offenses were also to be tried effectively. And then the last one, the bond was signed because the British wanted their laws to be recognized and implemented successfully in Ghana. And I always say that this this bond marked the beginning of British judicial system, or the introduction of the British judicial system into the Gold Coast. And so now, if you rape somebody or you go and steal somebody, it wasn't the chiefs who were to trial such cases, but then we were supposed to use the judicial system, the laws pertaining to, or the punishments pertaining to stealing in Britain, and then it will be applied in the Gold Coast. And that is how of course, the British laws were introduced into the country by them. Of course. Now let's take a look at the importance of the bond of 1844, or the significance of the bond of 1844. Now, the importance of the bond has been exaggerated in so many history books. Now, some actually date the beginning of British colonial rule in the Gold Coast from the day the bond was signed, and it is clear that the chiefs did not give their lands to the British government, nor did they bind themselves and their people to the British of course, to become a British subject. And so when you look at the terms in the bond that we have just looked at, the people did not accept that we surrender our sovereignty to you. No. All right. They were only asking for protection. And so there is no way somebody will say that the bond marked the beginning of British colonial rule in the Gold Coast. I disagree with that. Now, another important of the bond was that it also developed close relationship between the British and the coastal states. And it must be made clear that with the signing of the bond, the southern states were now looking up to the British to provide them with other social amenities, of course, that we said in there. And also the bond also merely, of course, recognized Maclean's former illegal administration of justice. And the next one was the beginning of English laws, as you heard in there. And then also the bond also made it possible to keep in check other human, of course, sacrifices, as well as, of course, robberies, of course, which were not good, were all checked. And so this is basically about the bond of 1844. I don't know your idea or what you think about the bond of 1844. You can share in the comment section any new information about the bond of 1844, and we will be glad to do that. Thank you very much for your time, and have a nice day.